Margaret Chen never thought her life would change when her husband got his dream job. For 15 years, she had been perfectly happy being a wife and mother. Her days were filled with packing school lunches, helping with homework, and making sure dinner was ready when her husband David came home from work. It was a simple life, but it was hers, and she loved it. David was a music professor, and he had always dreamed of teaching at a prestigious conservatory. When the Metropolitan Conservatory of Music offered him a position, he was over the moon. Margaret was happy for him, truly she was. She just didn't realize that his new job would drag her into a world she had desperately tried to forget. The trouble started 3 weeks after they moved into their new home near the conservatory. David came home one evening with a thick envelope in his hand and an uncomfortable look on his face. Margaret was stirring pasta sauce when he walked into the kitchen. "Honey, we need to talk about something," David said, loosening his tie. Margaret turned down the heat on the stove and faced him. "What's wrong? Is everything okay at work?" "Everything's fine, it's just—" David pulled out a formal-looking letter from the envelope. "The conservatory has this annual tradition. Every spring they hold a faculty showcase. It's a big event where donors and critics come to see what the conservatory is all about." "That sounds nice," Margaret said, though she had a sinking feeling in her stomach. "The thing is, all the faculty members participate, and so do their spouses." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Participate how?" "Well, most people perform. Some help with organizing or ushering. But the faculty committee really prefers if everyone showcases some kind of talent. It's about presenting the conservatory as a family of artists." "David, you know I don't do music anymore. I haven't touched a piano in years." I know. I told them that. "But they said you could help backstage or maybe introduce performers or something simple like that." Margaret relaxed a little. "That didn't sound too bad. Okay, I can do that. When do I need to meet with whoever is organizing it?" The next week, Margaret found herself sitting in a grand office inside the conservatory's main building. The walls were covered with photographs of famous musicians who had studied or taught there. Behind an enormous mahogany desk sat Professor Victoria Ashworth, the head of the piano department and the leader of the faculty committee. Professor Ashworth was exactly the kind of person who intimidated Margaret. She was tall and thin, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore an expensive black suit and pearl earrings, and when she looked at Margaret, it felt like she was examining something she found on the bottom of her shoe. "Mrs. Chen," Professor Ashworth said, her voice cool and precise, "your husband tells us you have some piano background." "Oh, just a little. I took lessons when I was young, but I stopped when I was 12. I'm really not a pianist." "I see." Professor Ashworth opened a folder on her desk. "And what do you do now?" "I'm a homemaker. I take care of our 2 children and manage the household." Something flickered across Professor Ashworth's face. It might have been disappointment or perhaps disdain. How traditional. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. There was something in the way the professor said that word. Like being a mother was something to be ashamed of. "Mrs. Chen, at the Metropolitan Conservatory, we pride ourselves on being a community of artists. Everyone here contributes to our cultural mission. Surely you understand that." "Yes, of course. That's why I'm happy to help backstage or with tickets or—" "We need performers, Mrs. Chen. We have plenty of volunteers for backstage work. What we don't have is full participation from faculty families in the artistic program. But I'm not a performer. I can barely remember how to read music." Professor Ashworth leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. "Let me be frank with you. Your husband is new here."
"He's untenured."
"His position, while secure for now, depends on many factors. One of those factors is how well he integrates into our community, how his family integrates into our community." Margaret felt a cold fear settle in her stomach. "Are you saying that if I don't perform, it could affect my husband's job?" "I'm saying that at the Metropolitan Conservatory we expect certain standards. We expect commitment. We expect excellence. When someone refuses to participate fully, it raises questions about their dedication to our mission." Margaret sat in stunned silence. This woman was threatening her husband's career because Margaret didn't want to embarrass herself playing piano in front of hundreds of people. "I don't understand," Margaret finally said. "Why does it matter so much? I'm not a musician. I'm just someone's wife." "Exactly my point, Mrs. Chen. You're not just someone's wife. You're part of the conservatory family now, and we need you to step up." 2 days later, Margaret received another letter. This one contained her assignment for the showcase. When she opened it, her hands started shaking so badly that she had to sit down. They wanted her to perform Liszt's La Campanella. Margaret didn't know much about classical piano anymore, but she knew enough to understand that this piece was brutally difficult. It was the kind of music that concert pianists spent months preparing. It was full of impossible jumps, lightning-fast passages, and technical challenges that even skilled players struggled with, and they were giving her 6 weeks to learn it. Margaret called David at work, her voice shaking. "Did you see what they assigned me?" "I just got a copy." "Margaret, I'm so sorry." "I don't know what they're thinking. That piece is way too advanced. David, I can't do this. This is insane. I'm going to embarrass myself, embarrass you, embarrass the whole conservatory." "Why would they do this?" David was quiet for a moment. I think maybe that's the point." "What do you mean?" "Some of the other professors have been talking. Apparently, all the other faculty wives have serious musical backgrounds. One was an opera singer. Another played in the symphony. I think they see you as, I don't know, not fitting in. So they're setting me up to fail. I don't want to believe that, but I don't know what else to think." That evening, Margaret sat at the old upright piano in their living room. It had belonged to David's mother and had moved with them from house to house, mostly serving as a piece of furniture that collected family photos. Margaret lifted the keyboard cover and dust motes danced in the evening light. She pressed middle C. The note rang out, slightly out of tune. She tried a simple scale, something she had learned in her first year of lessons 25 years ago. Her fingers stumbled over the white keys like strangers meeting for the first time. Margaret put her head in her hands and cried. 6 weeks. They had given her 6 weeks to learn a piece that virtuoso pianists prepared for months. She was being thrown to the wolves, and there was nothing she could do about it. If she refused, David's job was at risk. If she tried and failed, which she certainly would, she would humiliate herself in front of hundreds of people from the classical music world. Either way, Professor Victoria Ashworth and her committee had won, but Margaret had no choice. She would have to try. She would have to walk onto that stage in 6 weeks and attempt the impossible, and when she failed, at least she could say she had done her best. She opened the sheet music for La Campanella and stared at the pages of impossibly dense notes. They looked like tiny black insects swarming across the white paper, mocking her. Margaret took a deep breath, positioned her hands over the keys, and began the most difficult challenge of her entire life. The first official practice session was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Margaret dropped her kids at school and drove to the conservatory with sweaty palms and a racing heart. She had spent the weekend trying to practice at home, but it was hopeless. Her fingers couldn't even manage the opening measures without stumbling. Professor Ashworth was waiting for her in one of the practice rooms. The room was small and cold, with a beautiful grand piano in the center and large windows overlooking the conservatory grounds. Margaret felt like she was walking into an execution chamber. "Mrs. Chen, sit down, please," Professor Ashworth said, gesturing to the piano bench. Margaret sat, placing her worn sheet music on the stand. She noticed that Professor Ashworth didn't have any music in front of her. Of course she didn't. She had probably memorized this piece decades ago. "Play what you've prepared," the professor said, crossing her arms. Margaret's hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. She started the opening passage, trying to remember the fingering she had practiced all weekend. Within 8 bars, she made 3 obvious mistakes. "Stop," Professor Ashworth said sharply. "What was that?" "I'm sorry, I'm just nervous." "No, that's not nerves. That's incompetence. Your hand position is completely wrong. Look at your wrists. You're playing like someone who learned from a book. Did you even have proper instruction as a child?" Margaret felt her face burning. "I had a teacher. I only studied until I was 12, but clearly." Professor Ashworth came closer, looming over Margaret. "Let me show you the correct position. Watch my hands." The professor sat beside Margaret on the bench and demonstrated the opening passage. Her hands moved with effortless grace, each note crystal clear and perfectly timed. It was beautiful. It also made Margaret feel even more hopeless. "Now you try," Professor Ashworth said, standing up. Margaret tried again. It was slightly better, but still nowhere near good enough. Again. Margaret played it again. Again. They spent 45 minutes on just the first page of music. Every time Margaret played, Professor Ashworth pointed out another flaw. Her tempo was wrong. Her dynamics were flat. Her phrasing was pedestrian. She was using too much pedal. Her fingers were too tense. She wasn't counting properly. By the end of the session, Margaret's hands were cramping and her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "Practice this section for 3 hours every day," Professor Ashworth said as she gathered her things. "You'll need to show significant improvement by Friday, or we'll need to consider whether you're capable of this at all." "What happens if I'm not capable?" Margaret asked quietly. Professor Ashworth looked at her with cold eyes. "That would be very unfortunate for everyone involved, especially your husband." The next session was with a different instructor. Professor Ashworth had assigned 3 teachers to rotate working with Margaret. The second instructor was a young man named Andre, probably in his late 20s. He was a recent graduate who had won several international competitions and was considered a rising star in the piano world. Andre was polite when he introduced himself, but Margaret could see the pity in his eyes. He had clearly been told that he was working with someone hopeless. "Okay, Mrs. Chen, let's see where you are with this piece," Andre said, speaking slowly and carefully like he was talking to a child. Margaret played the opening section that she had practiced obsessively for 3 days. She got through it without any major disasters. "That's okay," Andre said, though his tone suggested it was anything but you're playing all the notes without any feeling. You're not thinking about what the music means. Let me play it for you so you can hear the difference." Andre sat at the piano and played the same section. The difference was staggering. When Margaret played it, the notes were just sounds. When Andre played it, they told a story. Each phrase had shape and purpose. The music danced and sang. "Do you hear how I shaped that phrase?" Andre asked. "Do you hear the difference?" Margaret nodded, feeling miserable. Of course she heard the difference. Anyone could hear the difference, but understanding what made his playing beautiful and actually being able to do it herself were completely different things. "Let's try something simple," Andre said. "Just play me a scale, C major, nice and slow." Margaret played a C major scale. It was shaky and uneven. Andre sighed. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? How long has it been since you played piano regularly?" "About 23 years. "And in those 23 years, did you ever play at all?" "Maybe a few times. Just messing around. Nothing serious," Andre rubbed his forehead. "Okay, this is going to be difficult for me to say, but I need to be honest with you. Learning this piece in 6 weeks, starting from where you are now, it's probably not possible. This is one of the hardest pieces in the standard repertoire. Professional pianists spend months preparing it." "I know," Margaret whispered. "Then why did you agree to do this?" Margaret looked at her hands. "I didn't really have a choice." Andre looked uncomfortable. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. "Well, let's just do our best. We'll work on building your technique from the ground up. Maybe we can get you to a point where you can at least play a simplified version." The sessions with Andre were less cruel than those with Professor Ashworth, but somehow they were almost worse. His patience felt like condescension. Every time he slowly demonstrated something for her, every time he simplified an exercise because the real version was too hard, Margaret felt smaller and more inadequate. But it was the third instructor who broke her completely. His name was Professor Chen, which confused everyone since that was also Margaret's last name, though they weren't related. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, who had taught at the Conservatory for over 40 years. He had a reputation for being strict but effective. What Margaret quickly learned was that strict was a polite way of saying cruel. Professor Chen arrived for their first session carrying a thin wooden ruler. Margaret stared at it nervously. "Play," he commanded without introducing himself. Margaret started the piece. She made it through 2 pages before making a mistake in a difficult run of notes. Crack, the ruler came down on the piano right next to her hand, making a sharp sound that echoed through the practice room. Margaret jerked her hands back in shock. "Sloppy," Professor Chen said. "Again?" "I'm sorry, No excuses." "Again." Margaret tried again. This time she made it further before stumbling over a tricky chord progression. Crack. This time the ruler hit the keys where her hands had been a split second before. "You're not thinking. You're just hoping your fingers will land in the right place. That's not music. That's guessing." Again. The session continued like this for an hour. Every mistake was met with the sharp crack of the ruler and a cutting comment. Professor Chen called her lazy. He said she had hands like someone who had never worked hard at anything. He told her she was wasting his time. When Margaret finally left the practice room, she was shaking so badly she had to sit on a bench in the hallway for 10 minutes before she could walk to her car. Her hands were red from tension, and one knuckle was slightly bruised where she had flinched into the edge of the piano when the ruler came down too close. That night, Margaret practiced until her fingers were raw. She had to get better. She had to prove that she wasn't completely hopeless. But every time she played through a section, she heard Professor Ashworth's cold voice pointing out her pedestrian technique. She heard Andre's overly patient explanations. She heard the crack of Professor Chen's ruler. David came into the living room around 11 and found her with tears running down her face, still playing the same section over and over. "Margaret, honey, you should take a break. You've been practicing for hours. I can't stop. I have to get this right. They're all watching me fail, and I have to prove that I can do this. Maybe we should talk to the committee. Maybe there's another option." "There is no other option." Margaret's voice cracked. "Don't you understand? If I quit, they'll say I'm not committed. They'll say our family doesn't fit with the conservatory culture. And then where will you be?" David sat down next to her on the piano bench, but he didn't have any answers. He couldn't fix this. Nobody could. Margaret went back to practicing. Her fingers found the keys in the dark, stumbling through passages that seemed designed to be impossible, and somewhere in the back of her mind a small voice whispered that maybe that was exactly what they wanted. Maybe they had given her an impossible task so they could watch her break, but she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Even if it killed her, even if she humiliated herself on that stage, she would at least try. She would show up. She would play. Even if every note was wrong. 2 weeks before the performance, Margaret was exhausted in a way she had never been before. She woke up with aching hands. She fell asleep hearing the music in her head. Her children asked why Mommy was always tired. David suggested maybe she should see a doctor. But Margaret knew no doctor could fix what was wrong with her. She had improved slightly. She could stumble through most of the piece now without completely falling apart. But stumbling through was nowhere near good enough for a public performance in front of music critics and wealthy donors. She sounded like exactly what she was, someone who had no business attempting this piece. On Tuesday afternoon, Margaret finished a particularly brutal session with Professor Chen. He had been even worse than usual, actually rapping her knuckles with his ruler twice when she made the same mistake repeatedly. Her right hand was throbbing as she gathered her sheet music. "You're wasting my time," Professor Chen said as she headed for the door. "In 40 years of teaching, I have never seen someone with so little natural ability work so hard to achieve so little." Margaret didn't respond. What could she say? He was probably right. She walked through the conservatory hallways with her head down, trying not to cry in public. Other faculty wives passed her, whispering to each other and glancing in her direction. They all knew. Everyone knew that Margaret Chen was going to embarrass herself at the showcase. Margaret decided to practice for another hour before going home. She couldn't face her family yet, not with Professor Chen's words still echoing in her head. She made her way down to the basement level of the conservatory, where there were smaller, older practice rooms that students rarely used. She found an empty room and sat at the worn, upright piano. The keys were slightly sticky and the sound was tinny compared to the beautiful grand pianos upstairs. But Margaret didn't care. She just needed to play. She was 20 minutes into her practice when she heard the door creak open behind her. Margaret turned, expecting to see a student or maybe a janitor telling her the building was closing. Instead, she saw an older man in a maintenance uniform. He had to be in his 70s with kind eyes and a weathered face. He was holding a mop and bucket. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly. "Am I not supposed to be here?" "I can leave." No, the man said with a slight accent that Margaret couldn't quite place. "You stay. I just cleaned the hallway. But I hear you playing. I hope you don't mind that I listen for a minute." "Oh no, I don't mind. Though I'm not very good, I'm afraid." The man smiled. "You are learning Liszt La Campanella, a very difficult piece. You know it?" "I know music. I've been working here for 30 years. I hear everything." He set down his mop and leaned against the doorframe. "You play with much stress in your shoulders." "I can see from here," Margaret laughed bitterly. "Well, that's because I'm stressed. I have to perform this piece in 2 weeks and I'm nowhere near ready." "Why you perform if you're not ready?" "Because I don't have a choice. The man nodded slowly like he understood more than Margaret had said. I am Joseph Kowalski. People call me Joe. I'm Margaret. Margaret, that is a nice name. Can I ask you something, Margaret? You played this piece before? Long time ago, maybe? Margaret froze. Her hands went still on the keys. Why would you ask that? Because sometimes when you play, I hear something. Like a memory trying to come back. Your fingers, they know things your mind has forgotten. Nobody had noticed that. Not Professor Ashworth with all her criticism. Not Andre with all his demonstrations. Not even cruel Professor Chen. But this janitor, this man named Joe, he had heard something in her playing that nobody else had. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Can I tell you something? But you have to promise not to tell anyone else. I am very good with secrets, Joe said gently. And then it all came spilling out. Margaret told him everything. How she had been Margaret Lung before she married. How she had been a child prodigy, winning competitions and performing in concert halls from the time she was 8 years old. How everyone said she would be one of the great pianists of her generation. She told him about the pressure, the constant practicing, the way her parents pushed her, the expectations that grew heavier every year. And then she told him about that night when she was 16. The biggest concert of her young life, a major hall, important critics. Her teacher had told her this performance could launch her professional career. I walked onto that stage, Margaret said, her voice shaking with the memory. I sat at the piano. I put my hands on the keys. And then, nothing. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there frozen while hundreds of people stared at me. For 2 whole minutes I sat there. The longest 2 minutes of my life. What happened then? Joe asked quietly. I ran. I got up and I ran off the stage. My teacher tried to stop me, but I just kept running. I ran out of the concert hall and I never went back. Never. I stopped lessons. I stopped practicing. I changed my name when I got married. I never told anyone, not even my husband, that I used to be that person. I became someone new, someone safe, someone who would never have to feel that kind of terror again. Joe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And the piece you froze on that night, what was it?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. You already know, don't you? That's why you asked if I played it before. La Campanella, Joe said. La Campanella, Margaret confirmed. Of all the pieces in the world, Professor Ashworth chose the one piece that destroyed my life. I don't know if it was deliberate or just the universe's idea of a joke. Maybe it's neither, Joe said. Maybe it's a chance to face old fear, or maybe it's a chance to relive my worst nightmare in front of everyone. Margaret wiped her eyes. That's what's going to happen, you know. I'm going to walk on that stage and I'm going to freeze again. Or I'm going to play terribly and humiliate myself. Either way, I lose. Joe came further into the room and sat on an old chair in the corner. Can I tell you what I hear when you play? What? I hear someone fighting. You fight the piano. You fight the music. You fight your own hands. Everything is battle. That's because everyone keeps telling me I'm doing it wrong. My technique is wrong. My tempo is wrong. My interpretation is wrong. Everything about me is wrong. Maybe what is wrong is that you try to play their way instead of your way. Margaret shook her head. Joe, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't have my way anymore. That girl who could play, she's gone. She disappeared that night on stage. I'm just someone who used to be a pianist. Past tense. I don't think so, Joe said firmly. I think she's still there. I hear her sometimes when you play and you forget to be afraid. Just for a second, she comes back. Then you remember you're supposed to be scared and she hides again. Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. I can't just magically get over 18 years of fear in 2 weeks. Joe stood up and grabbed his mop. Maybe not. But maybe you stop trying to learn the piece like Professor Ashworth want. Maybe you stop trying to play like Andre. Maybe instead you remember how you used to play. When you were that young girl who won competitions. Before the fear came. I don't know how to do that. Then maybe you start by asking yourself why you love music in the first place. Before the pressure, before the competition, before that bad night. What made little Margaret love the piano? Joe left then, pushing his bucket down the hallway. Margaret sat alone in the practice room, his question hanging in the air. Why had she loved music? She thought back to her earliest memories of piano. Before the competitions, before the expectations. She remembered being 6 years old, sitting at her grandmother's old piano making up songs, She remembered the joy of discovering that pressing these keys could create beauty. She remembered playing just for the pure pleasure of it. When had it stopped being joyful? When had it become a burden? Margaret looked at the sheet music for La Campanella. For weeks, she had seen it as an enemy, an impossible challenge designed to break her. But once long ago she had loved this piece. She had loved the way the notes danced and sparkled. She had loved the challenge of making her fingers fly across the keys. She had performed it with joy, not fear. Could she find that feeling again? Not in 2 weeks, probably. Maybe not ever. But maybe Jo was right about one thing. Maybe she needed to stop fighting and start remembering. Margaret placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't think about Professor Ashworth's criticism or Andre's pity or Professor Chen's ruler. She just played. And for just a moment, deep underneath all the rust and fear, she felt something familiar stir, something that had been sleeping for 18 years. It wasn't much. Just a flicker. But it was something. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Jo had said, about fighting the music instead of feeling it, about the girl she used to be before everything fell apart. Around midnight, she got out of bed quietly so she wouldn't wake David. She went downstairs to the living room and sat at their old piano. In the dark, with just a small lamp on, she opened the sheet music for La Campanella. But this time she didn't start practicing the way her 3 instructors had taught her. She just looked at the notes. Really looked at them. And slowly memories started coming back. She remembered being 13 learning this piece for the first time. Her old teacher, Mrs. Yamamoto, had told her that the title meant the little bell. The music was supposed to sound like bells ringing, bright and clear and joyful. Mrs. Yamamoto never hit her with rulers or called her incompetent. She had made music feel like magic. Margaret closed her eyes and let her fingers find the keys. She didn't think about Professor Ashworth's corrections or Andre's simplified versions or Professor Chen's ruler. She just tried to remember how it felt to play when she was young and fearless. Her fingers stumbled at first, but then something shifted. Muscle memory that had been buried for 18 years began to surface. Her hands remembered patterns that her conscious mind had forgotten. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. It was real. Margaret practiced like this every night that week. During the day, she went to her official sessions with the 3 instructors, nodding at their corrections and doing what they asked. But at night, alone, she practiced her own way. She let her hands remember. She let the music flow instead of forcing it. On Thursday evening, she was practicing in the basement room again when Jo appeared with his cleaning cart. "You sound different," he said, smiling. "Better. I'm trying what you said. Trying to remember instead of learn." "Good. This is good." Jo sat in his usual corner chair. "Can I stay and listen?" Of course. Margaret played through the entire piece. She made mistakes, but somehow they didn't feel as devastating as before. The music had shape now. It had feeling. When she finished, Jo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Now you sound like someone who knows this music. Like old friend, not enemy." "I do know it," Margaret admitted. "I performed this piece 3 times when I was young. Once at a competition, once at a charity concert, and then, that last time." "The time you ran?" "Yes." "Margaret, can I ask you something? That night when you froze, what were you thinking about?" Margaret had to think about that. It had been so long ago, but the memory was still painfully clear. "I was thinking about everything that could go wrong. I was thinking about the critics in the audience. I was thinking about my parents expecting me to be perfect. I was thinking about my teacher who had told everyone I would be a star. I was thinking about not disappointing everyone. The pressure just crushed me. And when you play now, for your children maybe, or just for yourself, what you think about? I don't know. I haven't really played for joy in years. Not since that night." Jo leaned forward. "Then maybe that is what you need to find again. Not the performance. Not the perfection. Just the joy. The reason you fell in love with piano when you were small." After Jo left, Margaret sat at the piano for a long time, thinking. The showcase was now just 10 days away. 10 days to undo 18 years of fear. It seemed impossible, but maybe Jo was right. Maybe she had been approaching this all wrong. She had been so focused on not failing that she forgot why anyone plays music in the first place. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She called the conservatory and canceled all her remaining coaching sessions. No more Professor Ashworth. No more Andre. No more Professor Chen and his ruler. When Professor Ashworth called her back an hour later, her voice was ice cold. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you've canceled your remaining sessions. May I ask why? I need to practice on my own for the rest of the week. That's highly irregular. We've invested considerable time in your training, and I appreciate that. But I need to do this my way now." There was a long pause. Then Professor Ashworth said, "I see. Well, I suppose it doesn't matter much at this point. We've all seen your progress or lack thereof. Do what you like. We'll see you at the performance." The way she said it made it clear what she expected: complete disaster. After she hung up, Margaret felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, she could practice without someone standing over her, criticizing every note. She spent the next week living practically at the conservatory. She would drop her kids at school, then head straight to the basement practice rooms. She practiced for hours, taking breaks only to eat lunch or stretch her cramping hands. But this practicing was different. She wasn't drilling scales or working on technique. She was reconnecting with the music. She was remembering who she used to be. Joe checked on her every evening after the building emptied out. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he just sat quietly in the corner. His presence was comforting, like having a friend in her corner when everyone else expected her to fail. "You know," Margaret said one evening, "you never told me your story. How did you end up working at a conservatory? Do you play music?" Joe smiled. "Long time ago in Poland, I was violinist. Not famous, but good enough. I play an orchestra for many years. What happened? Arthritis. My hands, they don't work so good anymore. Can't hold bow steady," he shrugged. "So I come to America and I find work here. It's not same as playing, but I still get to be around music. I hear students practice. I hear concerts. Is enough. Don't you miss it? Playing, I mean. Every day. But you know what I learn? Music is not just about playing. It is about loving. I still love music even if I can't make it myself. And sometimes I help people like you remember why they love it too." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Joe, for everything." "You don't thank me yet. Wait until after the performance," he winked. "But I think you will be okay. I think maybe you surprise everyone." 3 days before the showcase, something remarkable happened. Margaret was playing through La Campanella in the basement room when she realized she wasn't looking at the sheet music anymore. Her hands knew where to go. Her fingers found the keys without conscious thought. She had memorized it. Not through drilling and repetition, but through remembering. Her body had retained this piece all these years, waiting for her to come back to it. Margaret played it again, this time with her eyes closed. The music flowed out of her like it had been sleeping inside her, waiting to wake up. It wasn't perfect. There were still rough spots, still places where her technique wasn't as clean as it used to be. But it was real. It was honest. It was hers. When she finished, she opened her eyes and was startled to see she wasn't alone. A young student stood in the doorway, staring at her with wide eyes. "I'm sorry," the girl said. "I heard someone playing and that was beautiful." "Are you a professor here?" Margaret almost laughed. "No, I'm just someone's wife." "Well, you play like a professional." That was amazing. After the student left, Margaret sat at the piano, stunned. Someone had called her playing beautiful. Not technically correct or adequately prepared. Beautiful. That night, Margaret made another decision. She stopped going to the conservatory during the day. She stopped practicing obsessively. Instead, she spent time with her children. She cooked dinner with David. She went for walks. She lived her normal life. But every evening after her family went to bed, she went to the piano. And she played. Not because she had to. Not because someone was forcing her. But because she wanted to. She played for the girl she used to be. The one who loved music before it became a burden. The one who sat at her grandmother's piano and made up songs. The one who played for joy, not for judges. And slowly, that girl came back. On the night before the showcase, Margaret didn't practice at all. She had dinner with her family, helped her kids with their homework, and went to bed early. Before she turned off the light, David took her hand. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Margaret thought about it. "Yes, but not the way I expected to be." "What do you mean?" "I'm nervous about performing, but I'm not terrified anymore. Whatever happens tomorrow, I've already won something back, something I lost a long time ago. David squeezed her hand. I'm proud of you. I know this has been hard. Margaret smiled in the dark. It has. But maybe it needed to be. She fell asleep quickly, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't dream about falling apart on stage. She dreamed about music. She dreamed about bells ringing, bright and clear and joyful. She dreamed about coming home. The day of the showcase arrived with bright sunshine and a clear blue sky. Margaret woke up feeling strangely calm. She made breakfast for her family, packed lunches, and drove the kids to school like it was any other day. Good luck tonight, Mom, her daughter said before getting out of the car. We'll be cheering for you. Thank you, sweetheart. David had taken the day off to help her prepare, but Margaret didn't need much preparing. She had already decided what she would wear. A simple black dress she had bought years ago. Nothing fancy, nothing trying too hard, just herself. Are you sure you don't want to practice today? David asked over lunch. I'm sure. If I don't know it by now, a few more hours won't help. You seem different. Calmer than I expected. Margaret smiled. I think I finally figured something out. I've been so afraid of failing that I forgot there are worse things than failing. Like what? Like never trying at all. Like letting fear win. The showcase was scheduled to start at 7 in the evening. Margaret and David arrived at the Conservatory at 6. The grand concert hall was already bustling with activity. Ushers were seating early arrivals. Programs were being handed out. Behind the stage, performers were warming up and checking their instruments. Margaret found a quiet corner backstage and sat down. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. She felt ready. Professor Ashworth found her there 20 minutes before the show started. The older woman looked at Margaret with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Chen, I have to say I'm surprised you showed up. After you canceled all your coaching sessions, I assumed you had given up. No, Margaret said quietly. I didn't give up. Well, Professor Ashworth looked her up and down. We've put you last in the program. After all the other performances. That way, if things go badly, at least the audience will have seen some quality music first. Margaret just nodded. She wasn't going to let Professor Ashworth get under her skin. Not tonight. The showcase began. One by one, the faculty members and their spouses performed. There was a violin sonata, a soprano singing an aria, a cellist performing Bach. All of them were excellent. The audience applauded enthusiastically after each performance. Margaret watched from the wings. These were all accomplished musicians, people who had dedicated their lives to music. And here she was, a housewife who hadn't seriously played piano in 18 years, about to follow them on stage. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of performances, it was her turn. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. And now, for our final performance of the evening, we have Margaret Chen, wife of our newest faculty member, Professor David Chen. Mrs. Chen will be performing Liszt's La Campanella. There was a murmur in the audience. Margaret heard someone whisper, "Isn't that terribly difficult?" Someone else responded, "This should be interesting." Margaret stood up and walked toward the stage entrance. As she passed the backstage area, she saw Professor Ashworth leaning over to Andre, whispering something. Both of them were smiling like they were sharing a private joke. In the corner, Professor Chen watched with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. They were all waiting for her to fail. Margaret stepped out onto the stage. The lights were bright, much brighter than she remembered from her youth. The audience was packed with people, donors, critics, music lovers, faculty families. Hundreds of eyes watching her. For a moment, Margaret felt the old fear rising. This was it. This was the moment when she would freeze again, just like she had at 16, history repeating itself. But then, in the back row of the concert hall, she saw Joe. He was in his maintenance uniform, standing by the back wall. He wasn't supposed to be in the audience. The staff usually watched from the video monitors in the break room. But he had come. He was there for her. Joe caught her eye and smiled. He gave her a small nod like he was saying, "You've got this." Margaret walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. She adjusted her position, took a breath, and placed her hands on the keys. The audience waited. Somewhere in the front row, Professor Ashworth was probably getting ready to smirk. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother's piano. She thought about being 6 years old, making up songs and laughing at the sounds. She thought about Mrs. Yamamoto teaching her that music was supposed to be joyful. She thought about the little bells ringing, and then she began to play. The opening notes rang out clear and bright. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the mechanical playing she had done in her coaching sessions. This was real. This was alive. The difficult passages that had tripped her up for weeks suddenly felt natural. Her hands knew where to go. The muscle memory that had been sleeping for 18 years was fully awake now. Margaret poured everything into the music. All the fear she had overcome, all the pain of those brutal coaching sessions, all the joy she had rediscovered. Every emotion flowed through her fingers into the keys. The audience was completely silent. Even the people who had been whispering fell quiet. Margaret opened her eyes and saw the piano keys dancing beneath her hands. She saw the music happening, felt it happening, and for the first time in 18 years she wasn't afraid. She was home. The piece built toward its climax, the notes cascading faster and faster like bells ringing across a valley. Margaret's hands flew across the keys with precision and power. This was the section that professional pianists struggled with, the part that required years of technique to master. Margaret played it perfectly. As she struck the final chord, the sound hung in the air for a moment. Then the hall erupted. The audience leaped to their feet, applauding wildly. People were shouting, "Brava!" Some were wiping tears from their eyes. The ovation went on and on. Margaret stood and bowed, her heart pounding. She looked out at the audience and saw David in the third row, crying and clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Her children were jumping up and down, screaming with excitement, and in the back Joe was applauding with the biggest smile on his face. Margaret bowed again and walked off stage. The applause followed her into the wings. Backstage there was chaos. Other performers rushed up to congratulate her. People she had never met wanted to shake her hand. Someone from a music magazine asked if they could interview her, but Margaret barely heard any of it. She was looking for 3 specific people. She found Professor Ashworth first. The older woman's face was pale, her expression shocked. She looked like someone had slapped her. That was... Professor Ashworth started, then stopped. For once she seemed unable to find cutting words. "Not what you expected?" Margaret asked calmly. How did you... I remembered who I used to be. Before people like you tried to break me. Margaret turned away. "Oh, and Professor Ashworth? I'll be filing a formal complaint about the teaching methods used during my coaching, especially Professor Chen's ruler." She found Andre next. The young pianist looked genuinely impressed, though also confused. "Mrs. Chen, that was extraordinary. I don't understand. You played like someone who's been performing this piece for years." "I have," Margaret said. 18 years ago I performed it at the Warsaw Piano Competition. I was Margaret Lung then." Andre's eyes went wide. "Margaret Lung? The prodigy who disappeared? That was you?" "That was me." Word spread quickly. Within minutes, people were pulling up old articles and videos on their phones. A critic who had been in the audience approached Margaret with tears in his eyes. "I saw you perform when you were 16, at the Harrison Concert Hall. I've wondered for years what happened to you. Your disappearance was one of the great mysteries of the classical music world." "I had to walk away," Margaret said simply. "The pressure was too much. I needed to be someone else for a while. Will you perform again? Record tour?" Margaret smiled and shook her head. "No, I did this for me, to prove to myself that I could. But my life is with my family now. I'm happy being exactly who I am." Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the hall was empty, Margaret found Joe in the basement hallway. Pushing his cleaning cart. "You did it," he said, beaming. "You were magnificent." "I couldn't have done it without you, Joe. You helped me remember." "No, you did that yourself. I just reminded you to look. Will you be okay? After I file that complaint about Professor Chen?" Joe shrugged. "I am old. I can retire happy now. I got to see something beautiful tonight." Margaret hugged him, this kind janitor who had seen what no one else could see. David drove them home that night in silence. Finally he said, "Why didn't you ever tell me? About who you were?" "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore. The pressure, the expectations, it destroyed me. I needed to be someone new." "But you're amazing." "I'm not amazing. I'm just someone who used to play piano. And then I stopped. And then I started again. That's all. Will you keep playing?" Margaret thought about it. "Maybe, sometimes, for myself." For the kids. But not like before. Never like that again. When they got home, Margaret went to the living room piano. She sat down and played a simple melody, something her daughter had been learning. It was easy and sweet and perfect. Her daughter came downstairs in her pajamas. "Mom, you were so good tonight. Will you teach me to play like that?" Margaret pulled her daughter onto her lap. "Sweetheart, I'll teach you to play for the right reasons. To play because you love it, not because someone is forcing you. Can you promise me that?" "I promise." Margaret began teaching her a simple song, their hands side by side on the keys. And for the first time since she was a little girl herself, making music felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Like joy, like home, like love.